So Your Excellencies, distinguished professors, and distinguished staff, members of this distinguished great university, I'm pleased to thank the organizers of this event, especially Mr. Eruki Tomioja, Chairman of the Board, Historians Without Borders, and to thank you, Your Excellency, Bishop of Helsinki, and all of you, my brothers and sisters, for this occasion to be here in your midst and to want to share a few thoughts with you on the role and the character of history, especially in the context of peace building and the context of reconciliating people. I thank you, Mr. Eki, for your warm words of introduction and everything that has brought us here. If you were wondering which airlines brought us so punctually on time, it was the German. It was Lufthansa. So you may send them the medal. I have the opportunity then to share with you this afternoon these other few reflections on a subject matter that you'll be dealing with already since yesterday. Not having been part of the opening discussions and the speeches, I recognize that I may be treading on some already trodden paths and dealing with issues that probably have come up already and have been dealt with. If that happens, I just ask to be forgiven. It's probably been said already here since this program is began that a very common statement, at least in our part of the world, is that it's only winners who write history. Losers hardly write histories, and history is to a large extent written by winners. That being the case, I'd like to share a few thoughts with you about the role of history in this regard, especially in the setting of peace building and reconciliation, and address this essentially for who I am. So I'm a Catholic by faith. I work for the Vatican or the Holy See, but I am from Ghana, West Africa. And so I come before you this afternoon with all of these identities. And it is from these same perspectives that I wish to share the few thoughts that I'm about to share with you. So what can be the contribution then that I can bring to this? Certainly, I can share the experience of the use of history in religious literatures, especially in scripture, which is the source and the basis of our belief system, the type of historiography which is found very much in the Old Testament and which finds its fulfillment in the New Testament later. I can also share with you the experience from our part of the continent about certain crucial historical experiences, like the slave trade, and even like the meeting in Berlin, which divided the African continent into the different states that we do have now, the impact of that on the different states and the peoples on that continent, recognizing how that division split tribes and assigned tribes to different countries which become sovereign states, and then probably struggle to develop relationship among themselves. We can look at that, but again, we can also look at being here as a cardinal of the Catholic Church to see about how all of this is also true, also in the Catholic Church. Its own statements in the past, its documents which have contributed to certain historical developments, and how the popes have later on tried to reevaluate some of these documents in the light of several world historical events and conditions. There are very many of you who are very familiar with the origins of biblical Christian faith, recognize how much history is part of the development and the formulation of our faith. History becomes a context for the development of biblical faith. History is a context for the development of everything that we know about the God of the Old Testament, who then finds fulfillment in the New Testament writings. And so in the Old Testament, an event like the Exodus becomes a very crucial event that encapsulates, as it were, the memory of the people of God in the Old Testament, and which becomes a crucial point of reference subsequently in the history of God's people in the Old Testament. It becomes a point of reference for the people's own relationship with God, God reminding them all the time not to forget what he did for them, the mighty works that he displayed on their behalf, and that brought them out of Egypt to their own land of promise. This is taken only by another subsequent liberation event, which is the ending of the captivity of Babylon, which would again become another motif in the Old Testament, with God's people presenting their own relationship with God and with one another. So this is historical experience and part of the experience in which history, in the form of a memory, has shaped the lives of these people. So history, in the sense of the events which make such experiences, then build a memory which becomes a source, in the sense of the Old Testament, of legislations, which become the source of ethics or morality, and which becomes a source of point of reference even for relationship with other tribes and other people around them. Memory then becomes very crucial in this. And the formation of memories through historical events is stuff that we can look at and spend a lot of time discussing and considering. For the same reason, we can also look at similar events, this time stepping out of the Old Testament. As I briefly mentioned, we can look at events in the context of the continent of Africa, the famous slave trade, and the castles which it left behind, so that we still have memory of that. We do have memories of the slave trade, not only when we visit the United States and see the Afro-Americans over there. We have memories of the slave trade when we visit the West African sea coast and see the castles which dot the sea coast and the reminders that they provide about what went on in those castles. There is also a thing about colonization that we can also think about as a crucial historical experience, which is also formed a memory for the people in the area. These then can also become memories, the evaluation of which can become a subject matter of our discussion. To what extent all of this promote peace building, and to what extent all of this promote reconciliation and making people live together in harmony. I will try briefly to go through all of this, but most importantly to see how, as a church, we make use of some of these epochal events which have built big memories for people, how they are reevaluated, but also how they are corrected, and how they are reintegrated in the new sense and new identity of the church itself. And so, for example, my dear friends, the church has always experienced a rereading of history in order to understand and to redirect her actions as she journeys on in the world. The famous ecumenical councils, for example, the last one being the Second Vatican Council, became a moment for the church to reread its past history, in the light of which it decided to set new trajectories along which to travel. One crucial document which captures the new trajectory that the church set for itself at the Second Vatican Council was a document called The Church in the Modern World, Gaudium et Spes, within which the church decided then to establish a new relationship with humanity. In fact, at the beginning of this council, what Pope John the 23rd had said was he wanted the windows of the church to be thrown open so that the world outside can see into the church and so that the church can see the world outside. With this, the Pope called for a new relationship between church and the world, or church and society. No more the thing of a church, as it were, considering itself as a disparate society and a group within the human family. So this signaled a new form of relationship in the light of which the past history of the church in several situations and occasions were reread. I just draw attention or point to just a few of these. To begin with, the Second Vatican Council, having begun 1963 to 65, was a council whose beginning coincided by design, by divine providence, with the independence movement in Africa. Several African countries got independent in the same period, in the 60s, just when the church had gathered in the Second Vatican Council to find out a new way of establishing a relationship with the church, with the world. And so right after this conference, Pope John 23rd made it a big concern to pick up and to develop the issue of development. Development as the new and the latest challenge to human existence. What is to happen to these new countries which are now emerging as new nation states? Decolonization had meant the development of new nation states, and how these were to be evaluated and considered became a subject matter of the Second Vatican Council on the issue of development. Accordingly, when Pope Paul VI succeeded Pope John the 23rd, in his first big encyclical called The Development of People, Populorum Progressio, he redefined peace in terms of development. And he said that the new name of peace was development. But immediately then added that development, however, is not possible without peace or peaceful environment. So the development of the new nation states became a big concern of the church. This is very significant. I mean, by hindsight, looking at a whole lot of church documents, part of which now is a big issue, for example, in a place like Canada. Some of the church documents had sometimes been taken as documents like terra nullius, no man's land, which accompanied the settlement of European states in places like North Canada, Australia, and several other places. A document that kind of gave the impression that these lands didn't have any inhabitants or people, and that people were free to amass and take possession of any land that they wanted. This is lately now being considered. The new Attorney General of Australia last year overrode this and dismissed the terra nullius type of doctrine, recognizing the Aborigines and their right to live on the land. So against some such backdrop, it becomes so meaningful why the church now should be interested in development of nations and development of people and help advance their cause. The second thing that comes up, again, from the point of view of the church, in terms of memory building and how events in the past are used to promote human development, peace, and reconciliation, is the fact that this same Second Vatican Council, which called for a new relationship between the church and the world outside, signaled a new way of looking and integrating the role of science in society and even in the life of the church. And so right after the Second Vatican Council, it took Pope John Paul II to set up a commission to reevaluate the role of Galileo in church history and in church thinking. The commission that evaluated that came out with a result which finally led again to the reformulation, reintegration of Galileo and his teaching within the church. The church recognizing, if you want, that he made a mistake with that redefinition, and so reintegrated Galileo within in history of the church. And so with that, Pope John Paul II again, signaling a new type of relationship, a new revisiting of memory and tradition, which led to a sense of reconciliation with the world of science and the new society in which the church found itself. And so in the case of the relationship with Galileo, Pope John Paul II talked about purifying memory. So historical events do not only build up memory, heritages as were used in the earlier discussion, but it comes to a point that also this memory needs to be revisited and sometimes even purified. And with the reintegration of Galileo within the church and the condemnation overturned, it was a case of revisiting memory and purifying it, correcting where this, it went wrong. At the same time, the same Pope will signal as another revisiting of memory in the light and in view of reconciliation and new peace building. And it will be revisiting the period in the past of the Inquisition. This revisit of this period also led to the Pope asking for pardon from the very many who suffered from this period in the past of the church's history, again with view to again fashion some reconciliations and some bond. So history in the form of memory is not cast in, as it were, a concrete block of stone. It's something that can be revisited, reinterpreted, and sometimes even corrected in the light of what human life and human development needs to be. So after the Second Vatican Council, then Pope John Paul II signaled these two movements for us. Speaking of painful history and the purification of memory, how could we then forget, this another move that Pope John Paul II made when he visited Senegal. Standing on the coast of Senegal, on an island called Gorée, and looking out across the Atlantic Ocean, Pope John Paul II again thought about the slave trade. And thinking about the slave trade again, he begged for forgiveness from above for the awful error of those who enslaved brothers and sisters who were destined to be recipients of the gospel. So these experiences are known within the church. Revisiting memory to purify them, however bitter and unpleasant they may be, always with view to reintegrating the church far better, in a better way within society. So the first was the symposium done of the Pontifical Council of Latin America, again in 1992, where Pope John Paul II again brought up the issue of history of evangelization in the Americas, itinerary, identity, and the hope of a continent. Receiving the participants of this symposium, the Pope said to them, "Therefore, we do not celebrate controversial historical events. We are aware of the fact that historical events and their interpretation are a complex reality which has to be studied carefully and patiently. From this is expected a valuable, serious, impartial input and a peaceful judgment on the facts. Actually, then, the historian has this task, not to be influenced by any partisan interests or later ideological thinking, which is the occasion for historical analogy, applying current values to events that did take place in the past, but dispassionately looking at the views with view to discovering the truth of events that happen and integrating them into human life and society. So this second symposium then is one which an office within the Vatican, the Historical and Theological Commission of the Central Committee of the Great Jubilee of Inquisition then took up. And with that again, the Pope says, speaking, I ask for forgiveness, and it is necessary to have exact knowledge of the facts and to put shortcomings with regard to what the gospel requires in the context where they are effectively found. And so the commission presented to the Pope John Paul II a dossier of 800 pages with clear content on the sinful nature of some of what happened in those days. This prompted the Pope to apologize again in the Church's name on the 12th of March in the year 2000 during a Mass celebration celebrating a Day of Atonement. So the smallest, the basic fact that I'm making is that events in the past do constitute memories with which we live. And living with this memory, every now and then new changes and new moments and situations in life invite us to revisit the memories and then to reevaluate them. Reevaluating the memories is always a tricky business because the temptation is there to apply current structures and values to things in the past. But the desire is always to find the truth about what happened and then to see how this can be well integrated in the present ongoing life of a community, of society, or even the world, so that reconciled, rendered harmonious again, it can realize the best of its own life. And so, my dear friends, the topic that you have dwelt on, as you can easily see, calls for careful discernment and considerable knowledge of history. The indispensable contribution of historians will certainly be a help to theologians and to people of faith in understanding their religion and understanding the basis even of their faith. But this also calls for due discernment and circumspection in evaluating events of the past with view to finding the truth so that the truth can be applied and truth can maintain and keep the society going. And so on the threshold then of the third millennium, Pope John Paul says to us again, standing on this threshold, we may rightly hope that political leaders and people, especially those involved in tragic conflicts fueled by hatred and the memory of often ancient wounds, will be guided by the spirit of forgiveness and reconciliation, exemplified by the Church's own initiative in asking for pardon and reconciliation for events of the past. Subsequently then, we've had other popes follow this instance, and the big relic of St. Andrew, which was kept by the Latin Church, is being restituted, given back to the Orthodox Church as a gesture again of healing of memory and promoting reconciliation. In the same way, last June, Pope Francis visits Bolivia, and in Bolivia, thinking about how the native population of Latin America suffered from early European arrivals and Christian work, again, ask for pardon for everything, every abusive treatment that was meted out to this indigenous population on the arrival of Europeans on that continent. So all of these revisits of history then become very crucial in terms of making history play very significant and important roles in the ongoing life of humanity and history. We need to revisit our memory, heal them where they need to healing, correct them where they need to be corrected, but make them positively then drive us on in our growth and our development. The conditions for interpreting this can indeed be risky, as I've tried to say, and there is the invitation to watch out sometimes for some traps. A reconciliation as a path to peace can sometimes be accompanied by some pitfalls, if not even holes. So let me now share with you some criteria borrowed again from same church documents about how some of these principles of revisiting memory with view to fashion reconciliation among groups and people can be done or are sometimes done. So we've mentioned Pope John Paul II and what he did in the year 2000. These criteria are influenced by the Christian faith, but in many ways they can contribute to a clear path in the arduous way to reconciliation and peace between people. I wish to recall here that the document with which the Pope celebrated reconciliation bears the title Memory and Reconciliation, the Church and the Faults of the Past. Memory and Reconciliation, the Church and the faults or mistakes, if you want, of the past. Obviously, it is not enough to scientifically study the subject of past mistakes with a highly competent commission. This does not solve the problem in itself. There is the need to recognize the established misconduct, the promise not to repeat them, and to repair the damage that arises from them, and to promote, if you want, a culture that repels the germs that produce the same evils in the past and recognize clearly the movement ahead. The task of responsibility in this is a crucial thing to look at. When we talk about visiting the memory with view to healing and making it serve the purpose of reconciliation, a big subject matter that comes up is responsibility. Responsibility in this sense then need to be understood either objectively or subjectively. Objective responsibility refers to the moral value of the act in itself, insofar as it is good or evil, and thus refers to the imputability of the action. Subjective responsibility concerns the effective perception by individual conscience of the goodness or the evil of the act performed. And so, subjective responsibility ceases and dies with the disappearance of the subject who performed the act. It is not transmitted through generation, and the descendants do not inherit subjective responsibility for the acts of their ancestors, if you want. And so in this case, asking for forgiveness presupposes a contemporaneity between those who are hurt by an action and those who committed it. The only responsibility then that is capable of continuing in history can be the objective kind, the objective responsibility, to which one may freely adhere subjectively or not. And therefore, the evil done often outlives the one who did it. And through the consequences of behavior, that can become a heavy burden on the consciences and memories of the descendants. In this sense, we know about how the state of Germany accepted to make amendment and repair for the Holocaust. We know about how the city of Liverpool in London also tried to make amendment for its role and part in the slave trade. And some such events do exist. They all represent case of recognizing taking objective responsibility for an event of the past and undertaking a gesture or an action to help heal them, always with view to helping to reintegrate an event of the past into the positive conduct of society in the present. And so it is necessary, above all, to take into account the different processes of reception of acts. It is the place of the communication around the event that we have to work on, making sure that the message reaches all the protagonists by creating communication relays and multipliers and avoiding misappropriation of the original meaning and the original meaning and objective sense of the event. In the next step, it is also necessary to specify the appropriate subject called to speak about the faults of the past or the mistakes. Discernment in this case is of great necessity. It is necessary to check whether the group or the individual that asks for forgiveness in any event, depending on the level of the offense, actually is the one to do so. However, one should not forget that reciprocity at times impossible because of the religious conviction of others in society and of dialogue partners cannot be considered an indispensable condition, and that the gratuity of love, at least for the Christian church, often expresses itself in unilateral initiatives and forgiveness. This said, I just briefly now want to draw attention to one or two dangers to be avoided as we try to revisit memory, try to heal them, and try to positively integrate them in the ongoing life of any society. A first danger to try to avoid is the trap of standing before those who begin a reconciliation process by judging, thinking that they are better. We must avoid arrogance that leads us to think that the people of the past or those accused of an evil or an deed in the past are the worst in human history. The evil haunts the man of all times, and all generations are called to make an examination of conscience for not walking the same path that led to the evil situations of the past. We can see how in many countries some judges have stood up, alleging to act for the salvation of the people, and they in turn became tormentors of the people by suffering that has just by rubbing in the pain of those whom they seek to, whose suffering they seek to alleviate. So revisiting the past, especially when one is on the offended side, may not be accompanied or may not be done with a sense of self-righteousness, condemning those who perpetrated a crime as the worst in history, but with a certain amount of openness that makes and allows for reconciliation. Second thing would be, it is wise to avoid asking the impossible reparation that would create even revolts and other damages. And so, firstly, the objectivity of reparation allows victims or their descendants not to stay in the wounds because the reparation has not arrived. On the other hand, the purpose for which the reparation is done, which is reintegration, repair, and the ongoing life of society, must affect the demands for repair that are made, putting reparation, reconciliation above the required demands for damages and repairs. Then we also need to recognize that the story of an individual is never the absolute. One's individual story needs to recognize that it fits into the story of humanity, and that the story of humanity is bigger than the story of an individual. It is almost like what Pope Francis has said lately, that the whole is bigger than a part. And in the light of this, seek revisiting the memory or an event of the past with view to healing it so that it can fit and promote the well-being of society, needs to invite and to recommend to those who are seeking such repair recognition for the greater good of society, rather than insisting on small individual reigns, which can then rupture and even sometimes disrupt the reparation or reconciliation that is needed. This happens every day. Just last December, in Paris, negotiating for the climate change for 1.5 or less than 2 degrees increase, we had nations who were insistent on the fact that coming from poorer nations, what they've been invited to make atonement for was basically caused by the rich Western nations. And so they are the ones to assume the brunt of all of this and assume the charge, the demands of everything that the climate change repair called for. And it called for a certain amount of reasoning to convince and to show that this is the time for repair and not the time to apportion or to assign blames so that we can all move on. So the whole is always bigger than the part, and sometimes the vision of that helps in the process of reconciliation and the process of bringing people together. So by way of concluding these small thoughts shared about how the revisiting of memory created by history need always to be done with view to promoting the ongoing life of a community in the here and now, and they need to avoid certain traps or certain gestures which stall or which even prevent such a reconciliation process. I come now to conclude by simply drawing attention to these few points in history, and to simply observe that when in 2014 Pope Francis went to speak to the Council of Europe, he insisted specifically on the fact that we need memory, we need courage, and we need a sound and a humane utopian vision that can direct our revisiting of our memory, and the courage to make it propel us into the future. Creativity then continues to meet the challenge of multiple polarity and transversality. And so for Pope Francis then, the prestigious, when he was given the prestigious award for Europe, the Charlemagne Prize, for his significant contribution to the consolidation and building of Europe, of European peace and solidarity. In receiving that award, the Pope again appealed to the culture of dialogue and the social economy by stating that this culture of dialogue invites us, both the victims and the victors, to come together to accept to talk about our wounds and our pains so that we can find new ways of reconciled existence and proceeding with our lives for the future. For this, then, the Pope recommends an education and dialogue for all to be begun and undertaken in schools, in centers of living, including even families, so that open to receiving and listening to one another, we succeed in fashioning reconciliation, building bridges, and fashioning a future that helps promote the well-being of the human family. And I thank you for your kind attention.